A continent reshaped, America's playground no longer. Developing and deepening South-South relations.
The time when Latin America just looked to the United States and Europe is over.
What shape will intracontinental cooperation take? A decade of natural resource-driven economic boom, millions lifted out of poverty, a transformed Latin America emerges. What future for a continent of competing visions?
There's no leader in the region presently.
And what challenges lie ahead?
The people will demand more and more.
And they are, in their millions, angrily protesting corruption and poor services. As the U.S. war on drugs fuels violence, against the backdrop of insecurity, poverty, and inequality, has Latin America broken loose from the U.S. grip once and for all?
I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire. After a decade of historic transformations and profound reflections, Latin America is emerging as a region reshaped. It has grown ever more independent of North America, ever more integrated, and at the same time plural and diverse, with various blueprints for development, from Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela to economic liberalism in Colombia, or a more centrist approach taken by the likes of Brazil and Argentina. Yet despite its diversity, it has become a continent of increasing importance among the world's emerging economies with a greater voice in world affairs. Nevertheless, it faces many new challenges, not least reversing and transcending the image that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called the backyard of the United States. To discuss the future of Latin America and its paramount relationship with the United States, we're joined by Greg Grandin, history professor at New York University and author of Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the U.S. and the Rise of the New Imperialism. Arlene Techner, a professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and editor of a number of books, including Thinking International Relations Differently, Worlding Beyond the West. And last but not least, Michael Hart, professor at Duke University and author of several books, including Empire, co-authored with Antonio Negri. But first, we look at the recent evolution of the continent along with former Brazilian President Lula da Silva.
It's been the Latin America decade of change. No longer a group of nations looking up to the United States, they now look outward, look to each other in new partnerships. It's allowed Latin America to slowly pry the fingers of America's grip off the clutch it had on the region for decades. It is a popular and at times populist movement. Hugo Chavez' firebrand self-styled socialism championed it. Rafael Correa, Evo Morales, and others were disciples of it. But this man, Brazil's Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva, perfected succeeding in it like no other. The former union leader led Brazil from 2003 to 2011, where his policies helped lift 28 million people out of poverty, 40 million into the new middle class, while also overseeing Brazil's biggest economic growth in decades, thanks to sound, independent economic and regional policies, notably independent of traditional Western powers.
When I arrived in the government, the trade relationship with Argentina was $7 billion. In 2012, it was $39 billion. The Brazilian trade with Latin America was $20 billion in 2002 and increased to $94 billion. The same happened with Africa, and the same happened with the Middle East. Actually, we started to understand that the unity among the countries from the South, among poor countries and emerging countries, extracting from each country its production and commercial potential, would allow their economic growth and at the same time allow us to redistribute the wealth to the poorest. The time when the Middle East just looked to the United States is over. The time when Africa just looked towards Europe is over. And the time when Latin America just looked to the United States and Europe is over.
The IMF, the ultimate symbol of Washington consensus of Western neoliberal groupthink that had a stranglehold on Brazil, until Lula wrote that last check paying off all of his country's loans to the bank. I asked him if that move made his country more independent.
No, it doesn't mean that we are more independent. It means we are totally independent. We don't have any debt to the IMF. It's the opposite. We lent $14 billion to the IMF, and now they want another $10 billion. So the relationship has been changed totally.
The last decade, while America and much of Europe were focused on wars in the Middle East, the Latin America left led a movement opening the doors in the region to China, which has shrunk America's influence here now. China's overall trade with Latin America has gone from $10 billion a year in 2000 to $100 billion in 2006 to over $200 billion today.
Perhaps the biggest legacy of the Latin America left, whether it be in Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, or here in Venezuela, is not so much what they've been able to accomplish as a group, but more importantly, how they've been able to change the way people think.
In my case, I'm very proud because for the first time, the poor people watched me in the television and they didn't see a president. They saw one of them who had arrived in the presidency. I was the worker who had arrived there. I wasn't strange to them. In Bolivia, the poor indigenous have never been so well represented as they are now. Have we done everything? No. But I think we are off to an extraordinary start so that the people can feel themselves much more strengthened, participating much more, and demanding more and more. I always say this: democracy is not a pact of silence. It is a society in movement, searching for new achievements. This is democracy, and I think that this is happening in all our dear Latin America. It doesn't matter how are the electoral results. You can be sure of one thing: the people will demand more and more, and this is good.
From Mercosul to CELAC to UNASUL, Latin America has become a soup of acronyms of regional political and economic bodies by Latin America, for Latin America, with no Western influence. But Lula da Silva says the United States still controls too much power in bodies of the United Nations.
I think that the U.S. will forever be an empire if you think about the country's wealth, the arms capacity of the country, the nuclear potential of the country. We need to have a civilized relationship with the United States, but it is important that the UN Security Council changes so that the world can be more represented. The permanent UN Security Council can't continue only with the countries from World War II. Where is the representation of Latin America? Where is the representation of Africa? So I think that the relationship with the United States will always be tense because they will always want to keep the status quo, and we will always want to change the status quo so that the poorest countries can participate.
But leftist Latin America is changing fast and facing real challenges. Chavez's successor barely won re-election by less than 2% of the vote and now faces a country with a troubled economy. In other recent elections, populist leader Correa in Ecuador easily won re-election, but in Mexico, a centrist candidate aligned with the U.S. prevailed. Argentina's Cristina Kirchner has economic troubles herself and a wave of protests at home. And Lula's successor, Dilma Rousseff, is struggling to get Brazil's economy back on track, and her risk-averse foreign policy has looked more inward. Challenges ahead for the Latin America left? Yes. But in a world of geopolitical uncertainty, it is sure America no longer completely dictates the region like it once did. Now the question is who the new crop of progressive leaders will be in the next decade. Can they keep the movement going, and what direction will it take? Gabriel Osando, Sao Paulo, for Empire.
Gentlemen, Arlene, welcome to Empire.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
Great.
Arlene, let's start with you. So Venezuela had held its elections. Maduro was expected to gain by some major margin. He didn't. What does that say about his presidency?
I think first it says that Maduro is not Chavez. Chavez was, in essence, the glue binding together very diverse sectors of what we call Chavismo in Venezuela. And Maduro simply lacks the extraordinary political capacities and the charisma that Chavez had, and that I think allowed for him to govern in many ways in a sort of Teflon presidency in which, alongside many benefits distributed to the population, many problems that arise in Venezuela were simply set aside in favor of his tremendous charisma.
I think in some ways, looking back on it historically, I mean, I think this would be an interesting thing for us to confront. What I think that Chavez might appear like a great transitional figure in Latin America. In some ways, he has enacted during his years of presidency forces of the future. I mean, giving space to social movements, addressing racial and social and economic inequalities. And in other ways, he will, I think, look something like a figure from the past in Latin America. His military past, his rule by charisma, the singularity of his figure rather than being a party.
Your point about the strongman ruling, I mean, that is a problem, isn't it, for progressive, presumably, regimes in Latin America, where instead of having the social movement have a say, the leader continues to be overly too vocal, perhaps.
Well, I mean, one has to recognize that all of the progressive governments in Latin America, I think one can even generalize this way, came to power on the backs of powerful social movements. Chavez, too, recognizes that the anti-IMF riots in 1989 were crucial for him, but more clearly in Ecuador and Bolivia, in Brazil and Argentina, these are progressive governments that came to power on the backs of social movements.
But do they undermine the social movements by being a bit too centrist and a bit too grabbing of power?
There's obviously a dialectic.
I think 14 years in power is a long time to be in a presidency, personally. I think one of the challenges faced by several governments of the left in Latin America is precisely how to continue with progressive policies, but accept transition of power. This is something, at least for me, has been disconcerting in the Venezuelan case in particular. Ecuador, I think, is clear that Rafael Correa, the current president, will not seek out another period, which he's announced this, and I think that's a positive thing. I think Chavez, alongside the very positive contributions, unfortunately would have stayed in power had he not become ill until his death, essentially.
But we do have the likes of Bachelet and Lula da Silva and so on and so forth that did move on.
Well, but they're also very different contexts, right? So Lula was elected in a society that had a very complex political and economic structure that in some ways constrained him. Not that he needed constraining, but there was no way he could have done. Chavez came to power in a complete collapse of the old political and economic order, and he was literally had to build him and the social movements behind him had to build something from scratch. One of the things about Venezuela, obviously, is oil, and it gave Chavez, in addition to his charisma and political skills, the ability to never actually be forced to confront contradictions within his own social base. He could negotiate, he could broker, and everybody can do what they want. People could be corrupt, people could build 21st century socialism, and those contradictions were never forced to resolve themselves.
You say that you brought up the subject of Correa before. He also won the elections, except he won it by more or less a landslide. He had similar case to Venezuela, with short of the oil, of course. They don't have that much oil, as much as Venezuela. But did he do better? In Ecuador, does he represent a better model for Central Latin America?
In terms of investment in infrastructure and industry, Correa offers a different model. His relationship to foreign capital has been somewhat less aggressive as well, which explains why there's a certain degree of foreign investment still in Ecuador and very little in Venezuela. And for some, this is added to the possibility to invest constructively in the Ecuadorian economy, in contrast to what's happened in Venezuela.
Certainly, the general sense in the continent is that people want not necessarily so much ideology, but they want services, they want peace and security, absolutely, as it were.
And I think they also want something different from neoliberalism. I think something that unites not only the left, but even the center today in Latin America is increasing opposition to the Washington consensus, increasing demands on the part of society for certain prerogatives provided by the state. And I think this is a tremendously positive shift that doesn't only happen in countries such as Venezuela. It happens in many other countries in the region, both at the national level and at local levels. Colombia is a case in point.
So you think the Chicago School, the Washington consensus, that's totally over. But you think also that there is a Latin consensus emerging?
There's certainly one of the foreign policy achievements of the last decade has been about interdependency and regional collaboration. I mean, it's not always completely consolidated, let's say. But I would say it's not only looking away from the Washington consensus, but in my mind, progressively more the U.S. really doesn't matter. I don't want to exaggerate and say that the U.S. has no effect, that the U.S., of course, is still a very large, powerful country.
Say in Peru, in Honduras, Colombia, Mexico, it's still playing
it still plays a role, but it does not have the capacity. This is what even if Washington were to want to, it does not have the capacity to influence these countries economically, militarily, politically, as it did previously. And that seems to me a great change that needs to be dealt with. And I think the promises of continental integration, and then perhaps even South-South relationships, the countries can geopolitically shift the region quite significantly.
Is that also a credit to be given to Brazil, and will then Brazil emerge as the new hegemon?
Well, I think Brazil is central to all of this. I think that Brazil is the anchor or the center of gravity that a lot of this revolves around. Its economy is enormous, and the opposition in Latin America to a free trade agreement is largely centered around Brazil, around issues of tariffs, around issues of intellectual property rights, and the free trade agreement of the Americas would be meaningless to the United States if it doesn't include Brazil. So it's central. I think there's a degree in which Brazil is emerging as a regional hegemon. I think that's obvious. I think that interests correspond to some degree.
So are we talking now about a Rio de Janeiro consensus in Latin America?
I think by maintaining stability in Bolivia and Ecuador, I think that ultimately benefits Brazilian economy as a whole. It creates even though there was certainly interest in Brazil and Sao Paulo that would have liked to see Evo go in 2008. So this is an example in which interests and ideals come together. I think the United States, to a large degree, in some ways, it's more dangerous. Back in the Cold War, when it administered Latin America as a single region, there was less of a willingness to play one region off of another. And I think what you're seeing a lot is as the United States' power is in recession, it's much more willing to try to pick off low-hanging fruit, whether it be in Honduras or whether it be in Paraguay, and play off one region off of another, which it wouldn't have done which it didn't do in the Cold War. And to a large degree, to give the United States credit, that created a certain degree of stability. From 1930s forward, all of the violence in Latin America was mostly internally directed against social movements. It wasn't interstate. There wasn't a lot of interstate wars from the 1930s through today.
But that certainly brings us today, and we were talking earlier about this puzzle about how, despite the social movements, despite the grassroots movements in most of the Latin American countries, there's a high degree of violence throughout Latin America, and Brazil included. Although now, because of the World Cup, they're trying to fight some of it, and pacification, you called it, campaign in the favelas and so on and so forth. What explains this widespread violence in Latin America?
Latin America is the region with the highest levels of inequality in the world. And if we add democracy to that, it is the region where there is democracy with alarming levels of inequality. And I think this is probably the first explanation for why violence and citizen insecurity in writ large is endemic to many countries in the region. And so you have a situation in which, notwithstanding the arrival of many different progressive governments, different in their approaches, but progressive in any sense, and in a social sense, they've been unable to alleviate completely levels of inequality. Brazil, under Lula, did actually reduce its inequality considerably, but it continues to be a country where inequality is tremendously high. That would be the first explanation. I think obviously the drug traffic and organized crime related to the drug traffic is a second explanation, perhaps.
And that is a transnational problem.
Of course, it's a transnational. It affects all the region in different ways.
And so, Michael, you were talking earlier about the various regional configurations and their importance and so on and so forth. Yeah. Why are these used in order to combat violence and organized crime and so on?
It doesn't seem to me a particularly easy problem.
Neither for me.
Yes. No, I mean, if one were to suggest, I think that you're right when you suggested before that it's in the interest of the social movements, the high level of violence and criminality and especially the drug trade is counter the interest of some of the most powerful social movements. But I don't see them as as capable at the national and regional level of combating it. Like, for instance, there are many projects, say in Argentina, of community-based policing or community-based and hence social movements attempting to address problems of narco trafficking or such things. But it seems to me a very difficult problem to address at that.
But do you agree with me that it's getting worse?
I would like to suggest just an idea. I don't agree that Brazil is a rising hegemon in the region. And I think one of the reasons why we're not seeing any new regional organizations such as UNASUR or CELAC, which groups together the entire region minus the United States and Canada, there's no leader in the region presently. And I think this is one of the explanations for why these new organizations have been ineffective in terms of addressing common problems affecting the entire region, such as violence, such as transnational types of flows, including drugs and weapons, which are obviously part of the problem as well. Brazil explicitly denies its interest in being a hegemon in the region. It's part of its diplomatic style. And much of what it does in Latin America has nothing to do with Latin America per se, but with trying to accredit itself as a global player.
That's even worse. So actually it's using Latin America as its backyard.
In my opinion, I don't know if it's using it as its backyard.
That's what you're saying,
it's interested in demonstrating to the international community that it is capable of exercising a role by which stability can be guaranteed, problems can be resolved. This is why UNASUR has been so important to its strategy, and obviously for assuring stability in order to promote its trade interests and its investment interests.
You're saying that we would be better off, or it would be a better situation if there were some charismatic leader that, like a Bolivar, who would unite the continent?
I think regional institutions would do better if there were perhaps a leader who could try to, create some type of consensus amongst the countries of the region as to how to go about resolving these problems, which are shared in many senses, and which in many cases are transnational. And I think a second reason has to do with the region's obsession with sovereignty. Sovereignty is part of Latin American states' DNA, and it's very difficult for the region's leaders to get together to address problems that by large are domestic in nature, even though they might be caused by transnational factors such as drugs or weapons.
So we have a real paradox here. So on the one hand, they're really obsessing about their sovereignty. On the other hand, they need integrative or regional serious.
I mean, this goes back, said part of the DNA, it's absolutely right. This goes back to independence. Latin America decolonized in unison, so immediately they had to not only deal with the problems of independence, but independence in the concert of other nations. And Bolivar's 1826 Panama Congress was just one of the first of many of these international congresses that struggled with these issues, exactly these issues of sovereignty and mutual cooperation.
Which probably brings us to the United States and its history in the continent, but we're going to address that after we come back from a news break. Welcome back with my guests, Greg Grandin, Michael Hart, and Arlene Techner. Predictably, the view from the north is quite different. The U.S. continues to monitor the political transformation of its southern neighbors with a degree of suspicion and discomfort. And although it seems to accept the limits of its influence in Latin America, Washington remains engaged on a number of important fronts, especially the infamous war on drugs. The $60 billion drug trafficking business continues to escalate at a huge human cost. In Mexico alone, 60,000 people have died from drug-related violence over the last 6 years. Al Jazeera's Latin American editor, Lucia Newman, explores the complexity of the war on drugs and its ramification on the North and the South alike.
The US-led war on drugs in Latin America, the longest and least successful prohibition campaign in history.
It's a failure. It's a total failure.
Colombian soldiers raid a cocaine lab in an area they once dared or could not tread. The giant jungle drug factory is found and destroyed, thanks in great part to massive US military aid and intelligence, a $9 billion program called Plan Colombia.
It has had certain successes, and they're undeniable. And the main one being the dismantling of some of the biggest organized crime syndicates in the world, which were the Colombian cartels. Many of them no longer exist. Those that still do exist are a shadow of their predecessors.
More than 40 years ago, U.S. President Richard Nixon declared the so-called war on drugs.
America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
But if Nixon's goal was to eliminate illegal narcotics at their point of origin, it hasn't worked.
The drugs are there. They are going through Colombia, the same that before, but and we are not able to stop it.
No one could accuse Cesar Gaviria, the president who took down the Medellin cartel and its infamous leader, Pablo Escobar, of being soft on drugs. Just realistic. The U.S. government has spent over $1 trillion in eradication, law enforcement, foreign aid, and even a full-blown U.S. invasion of Panama, all in the name of combating drug trafficking. The drug trafficking business is very much like squeezing a balloon. You put pressure on one side and the air displaces to the other. In the same way, drug traffickers are always seeking the point of less resistance. So in the last decade, it's Colombia's neighbors that have become more and more involved in the trade. Peru has now overtaken Colombia with 325 metric tons a year as the world's #1 producer and exporter of cocaine. In the last 10 years, coca leaf production has increased 35%. Today, it is the Mexican cartels that control the trade. They buy cocaine, marijuana, and heroin in Colombia and Peru. The drugs are then transported north by air, land, and sea to Venezuela to be shipped to Europe, Russia, and Asia, or to Central America, especially Honduras. From there to Mexico, and then across the border into the United States. 6 years of fighting the Mexican cartels have left more than 50,000 dead. Their influence and violence spreading to Central America, where violent gangs are now also being recruited. Honduras, a major transshipment point, can now boast the highest murder rate in the world.
The countries that have most suffered through the US success have been the Latin American nations, particularly the weaker nations which do not have the tools to fight transnational organized crime.
At last year's Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, leaders of the nations ravaged by drug-related violence forced U.S. President Barack Obama to agree to at least discuss the unthinkable, legalizing or regulating illegal narcotics.
Los carteles han crecido, se han desplazado de México.
The cartels have spread to Guatemala and are debilitating our institutions, as they are in other countries in the region. After 40 years as president, I have to ask, is it not time to search for an alternative?
Many argue that by making drugs illegal rather than regulating them, as many European nations have, the war on drugs has created a highly profitable black market that is spreading violence, corruption, and institutional instability throughout Latin America.
The U.S. has not been able to address this problem in an intelligent way. We are not able to change the situation of today of having so much violence because the U.S. doesn't change their policy. We depend totally on the U.S.
Lucia Newman, Cauca, Colombia, for Empire.
Arlene, well, you've come straight from Colombia. Tell us, is this war on drugs just an empty metaphor, or is it just not going very well? What is going on exactly?
It's not an empty metaphor. The United States has spent billions of dollars on combating drugs at their source in countries in Latin America, specifically the Andean region. Colombia alone has received, during 10 years of Plan Colombia, which began in 2000 and ended a couple of years ago, over $7 billion. And if we look at the figures of cocaine production and trafficking in the world, what we notice is that it hasn't been reduced at all, nor has consumption necessarily gone down around the world.
In the country, right? Consumption went up and the prices went down.
The prices have, they've gone down or remained constant. And so basically the strategy that the U.S. has employed has been to affect drugs at the source in order to make prices go up and affect consumption. As we know, consumption is price inelastic in the sense that people who consume constantly don't really care how much they have to pay for narcotics, just as long as they're available. And the fact is that they have continued to be available in U.S. And European markets, and increasingly in markets in Latin America, where consumption has risen tremendously over the course of the last decade.
You think of it as a true crusade against drugs, or is there something else there?
Well, I think there's something else there. I think that you have to look at it in two contexts. One was the 1990s, and you think of the two signature policies of Bill Clinton was Plan Colombia and NAFTA. And it's not just the war on drugs. The way the war on drugs fuses, particularly in the corridor running from Colombia through Central America and Mexico, fuses with neoliberalism, with this extreme flooding the regional markets with cheap agricultural products, which leads to displacement, the turning over more and more land to biofuels, to African palm, which leads to more displacement. You see this in Honduras, you see this in Guatemala, you see the price of basic food going up, you see more and more dislocation and people turning towards illegal trade, and then the response is more militarism. So as the report made very clear, that what Plan Colombia did was it may have broken up cartels in Colombia, but all it did was telegraph the violence up through Central America and Mexico. And
outsourcing violence.
In some ways, certainly the transportation of drugs, and it's led to the rise of gangs, and that calls for more militarism. Then if you step back and you think about the larger war on terror, under Clinton, the State Department tended to think of all of these transnational problems as discrete. You had money laundering, you had copyright piracy, you had drugs, you had gun running. After 9/11, the Bush administration made a very strong bid to fold all of these different wars or problems under the rubric of the war on terror. And they tried to, at a ministerial meeting of defense ministers in Santiago in 2002 and then in Quito in 2005, Rumsfeld really made a strong case for getting Latin America and South America and Central America on board on the war on terror.
But they are not coming on board.
Well, South America isn't. But faced with pushback on all sorts of ways, on the International Criminal Court, on Iraq, on all sorts of things, on Middle East policy, South America mostly has resisted and offered opposition. What you saw the Bush administration was really kind of retreat and to the security corridor and put into place the vision that they had for all of the hemisphere in a very much smaller place. And the disaster is, I mean, the report gave a sense of it, but the murder rate, the extreme misery, the hunger, I mean, there's severe malnutrition because people can't afford what they used to grow as a result of these free trade policies.
It's not as if the so-called war on drugs is a shadow that's hiding the true interest, but I think one has to take very seriously these military interests that are fed by the so-called war on drugs.
The former Mexican leader, Calderon, president, said America lacks the moral leadership to lead the war on drugs. Why aren't the Latin Americans putting America at bay and dealing with this problem themselves?
The countries of the region are trying to address the problem on their own. I think there's a number of contradictions in the way that they're going about doing so. The moral questionability of the United States, referred to by Calderon, has to do with increasing legalization of marijuana consumption in the United States at the state level, never at the federal level yet. And of course, how can a country such as the United States hold Latin America to account for drug production when indeed acceptance of marijuana consumption is on the rise?
Double standard, hypocritical?
I don't find it a double standard. It is at root, but I think marijuana is quite different from cocaine and other substances. And I think in mixing the two, maybe that's not the best argument to make. What is true is that increasingly the countries of the region, led by presidents such as Juan Manuel Santos, who was the first acting president in the region to come out and say that the drug war had to be reevaluated. And
coming from him, it's probably an important thing.
It's a very important thing because Colombia does have the moral authority, given years of combat without any positive results on U.S. terms. And so increasingly there is a certain degree of political will to discuss how to go about devising an alternative policy. Brazil is not on board in this discussion, and I think this points again to whether or not Brazil is actually playing a leadership role in the region. Brazil has been very quiet about the drug issue, and actually under President Dilma Rousseff is quite conservative in the way that it's tried to go about devising drug policy. Even leftist governments such as that of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua is tremendously conservative in terms of how to combat the issue. And I think this ties in again to the domestic effects of the drug traffic in many countries in the region. We're seeing rising levels of violence, amongst other things, resulting from the presence of organized crime. And many presidents are reluctant, again, to devise a regional scheme different from that of the United States to go about combating the problem. Colombia...
If Craig is right, that America is actually instrumentalizing the war drug in order to remain involved and impose its own neoliberal policies.
I have a hard time seeing the coincidence between the two just because of the timing. Colombia only just now signed a free trade agreement, just recently with the United States, following years of implementation of Plan Colombia, and even before that, drug war logics. The drug problem in Central America arrived after the signing of the free trade agreement with Central America. We're only seeing now... How
about the relationship with Mexico? You don't see the parallel there?
Mexico has been involved in different ways in the drug traffic since the 1970s. Mexico was a primary provider of marijuana in the 1970s. When the problem was combated there, marijuana moved to Colombia as a result of the balloon effect referred to.
But no, Mexico is responsible for 95%.
Yes,
of the drug trade in America.
I'm not sure how the war on drugs is conducive to creating an environment that favors the United States in trade terms, simply because of the tremendous amount of violence.
But I don't mean it in terms of, I don't mean it's a conspiracy, I certainly don't mean that neoliberalism is pegged exactly to the signing of free trade agreements. I mean, neoliberalism is a much broader packet of economic policies, and NAFTA just really ratified a bunch of policies that were already in place, as did CAFTA. But it's certainly the way that they feed off of each other, and it creates almost a perpetual war of a perfect machine of perpetual war, in the sense that it creates the dislocation, it creates the misery, it feeds these transnational networks of crime, and then it calls for a more militarized solution where dissent is criminalized in Central America.
But Craig, I don't see that the Obama administration is exactly interested in a volatile, in crisis, violent neighbor to the south.
Well, no, obviously it doesn't want a volatile situation to the south, but it certainly doesn't have the political will to exempt itself from, to come up with a different model.
Well, but you're saying it's the engine behind that.
I'm saying that these two policies feed off of each other, and they both are driven by different sets of interests. Look, the United States is a diverse country. There's lots of different vectors of power. It's not a bunch of people.
I would suggest that the Obama administration, if it could devise an alternative policy, might actually be willing to do so. I think there's a tremendous amount of bureaucratic inertia at play in the war on drugs. Most Congress people in the United States publicly come out and say that the war on drugs has been a failure, and yet no one is capable of designing an alternative. And I think this has to do with inertia.
Two things. One is I agree with that. I don't think that the Obama administration exhausts what we mean by American power. I think there's a lot of different interests at play. And the military, Southcom, and
I was going to add that as well. Southcom needs a mission in the region, and this is what it is.
What I'm talking about is that
this is the Trojan horse by which it gets into Latin America.
When you step back, you see an elective affinity of different interests that do feed off of each other and create the crisis. I don't think anybody's sitting in Washington saying we need to create a crisis in order to profit from it. I think that when you take,
perhaps it's the contrary. I mean, my feeling is, Michael, is that the Obama administration wants a calmer southern neighbor, so it turns its back to somewhere else for other priorities, Asian pivot, or I don't know what.
In my view, it's been a good thing over the last decade that there's been less attention from Washington on Latin American politics. I mean, in some ways, U.S. foreign policy directives should be something like do no harm. And I think that by having less attention from Washington, there have been many of the positive developments in progressive governments in Latin America have been possible because it hasn't been atop a priority on the Washington foreign policy agenda.
And this goes back to Eileen's point about why there's inertia, and part of it is one could imagine a very progressive set of policies coming out of the Obama administration towards Latin America that actually would increase U.S. power in the region, just the way as as an historian, going back to Roosevelt in 1933, by agreeing to the ideal of sovereignty and non-aggression, which Latin Americans had been pushing for decades, and the U.S. had resisted for decades. When he finally agreed to that in 1933, that didn't weaken U.S. power. That actually created a whole new set of ways in which the U.S. could project its power in the region without relying on militarism.
But I thought we agreed already that America's domination in Latin America is passé.
Well, one could imagine Obama doing the same thing. He could recognize Cuba. He could ban assault rifles that would satisfy Mexico. He would come up with a more sane trade policy. He could do a bunch of things. He could appease Brazil in terms of subsidies and intellectual property rights. The reason why he can't has nothing to do with Latin America. It has to do with the sclerosis of U.S.'s domestic policy. It's Florida and New Jersey that stopped sane policy on Cuba. Because in the past, U.S. political representatives were able to kind of combine and transcend sectional and particular and ideological interests to promote the general interest of the United States. The U.S. political establishment has lost its capacity absolutely to do that.
I think U.S. domination is in decline. I don't think it's passé. And I think issues such as drugs...
But is it reversible?
...and security in general...
Is it reversible?
It's not reversible, no. This is a process that I think will continue to grow as it's growing around the world. Right. But I think in the security realm in particular, and on the issue of drugs specifically, U.S. power and the capacity to impose, although in decline, has not disappeared by any means. And I think countries such as Guatemala, President Otto Morales came out speaking about the need to legalize. For many, this was essentially a strategy to gain the attention of Washington, right, so that Washington would provide funding needed to combat the drug threat in that country.
And it is considerable.
It's tremendously, it's considerable, the funding, and the threat is very large.
But on the other hand, your country of residence, Colombia, now is not only turning its back on the American-financed war against the FARC, now it's Cuba that is hosting the dialogue between the FARC and the Colombian government. That's quite an interesting twist in events.
It's a twist if you don't understand the history of Colombian relations with Cuba, which have actually been quite good.
And it's a good indication of just how divorced the U.S. is from the rest of the hemisphere. And it can't, I mean, recognizing Cuba and normalizing relations with Cuba would go very far in reestablishing better relations with Latin America as a whole.
Let's talk about this very important issue of the transnational element. Excuse my expression, I don't know if it's a correct one or not, the Latinization of North America. So although there's a lot of Colombian and Venezuelan expats who are not exactly friendly to the current regimes there, but there is a certain sensibility that is growing in this country, and it's not a neoliberal one, it's a Latin one. And that should, on the long term, bring more rapprochement between North and South America?
On a whole, I think that it is true that the arrival of migrants, mostly from Mexico and Central America, but also from South America, socializes the U.S. I mean, it's Latinos that revived the union movement in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. It's Latinos who gave the election to it's ironically might be Latinos.
The next Republican president.
It might be Latinos who finally break the dead hand of the Confederacy on the U.S. political system. It certainly weakened it. I mean, if Texas and and Arizona and New Mexico, but it could also work the other way, right? I mean,
no, but what you were saying earlier, it was more on the short-term 27 electoral votes and so on and so forth. But the major transformation that is happening in North America is, or should bring it closer than the Anglo-Saxon world of the past to its southern neighbor.
Yes, it should. But sometimes Latin American politics get refracted in the U.S. in strange ways. So the Honduran coup, for instance, galvanized and the Cuban right in Florida in ways that Obama capitulated, right? I'm sure Obama didn't orchestrate the coup in Honduras. There were interests in the U.S. that wanted a coup in Honduras. That's undoubted. But I'm sure the Obama administration probably didn't want a coup in Honduras. But but after a few months, when they had a lot of pressures from Florida and Louisiana making comparisons between Obama and Chavez, what did he do? He recognized and legitimate a coup that's had horrendous effects on the people in Honduras. I mean, the murder rate in Honduras,
Michael,
of political activists.
Just to end on yet another note of the nature on the long term, it seems that over the last few years, some of those major Latin American countries, closer or not so close to the United States, have been growing at a faster rate. They've been avoiding the financial crisis in so many ways, expanding their economies and so on and so forth. Does America, does North America, does Washington still have much to lecture South America about?
I think if you look at the region, we're talking about a tremendously diverse region, and it's impossible to speak of it in singular, as we tend to do when we talk about Latin America, or Africa, even worse. There's many countries in Latin America that continue to concentrate their trade relations with the United States.
Which is a positive thing.
Well, I don't know if I'd want 80 or 90% of my trade, as Mexico has with the United States, or over 50, but there's many countries.
You mean the concentration of it?
Yes, and I think in those cases, and in cases in which countries in Central America depend upon the United States still for military assistance and other types of assistance, there still is a tremendous degree of influence that Washington can exercise. I think as we move south and trade is much more diversified, we see growing autonomy on the part of different South American governments in particular vis-a-vis Washington.
Right.
And so I think it's difficult to speak of the region as one precisely because
But the general trend is that it's moving towards more autonomous Latin American
I see
future.
that happening, and I see the emergence of regional institutions such as UNASUR and CELAC as an indication of this and as an expression of Latin America's political will that this be the case.
Arlene, Michael, Greg, thank you for joining Empire. And I'll be back with a final thought. Since we recorded this episode, a number of Latin American countries have witnessed mass demonstrations that underline, once again, the vitality of their public opinion. Brazil witnessed the most widespread social unrest in recent times, demanding better education, healthcare, and good governance. Oil-fueled progress might have improved the lives of millions, but many more are angry at the government's waste and corruption. President Rousseff expressed her admiration for the protesters and promised to act quickly to try and meet their demands, but her numbers continued to plummet in the polls. Put simply, youth won't be taken for granted even by a president long known for her advocacy for social justice. When Brazilians express their dissatisfaction with their government spending on football stadiums ahead of the World Cup, you can be certain they mean business. The ball is back in the president's court. And that's the way it goes. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and watch us online. Until next time.